discussion. I do want to make a couple of statements to set the stage, because not Brian, of course, is not. I expect you haven't read Walter Isaacson's The Code Breaker. Yeah, terrific book. I highly recommend it. He's done so many interesting books about fascinating people. This development of CRISPR technology portends to enable the editing of human genes. So the first point I want to make is that you need to parse this issue into two different parts. One is distinguishing between editing of your own genes, which would not be passed on to your progeny. This is much less controversial, although it's still controversial, but let's say somebody has a inherited disease that can be cured by genetic means. You have some kind of a faulty gene or something like that. Huntington's disease, there are a whole bunch of these things. Who in the world would not want to allow people to solve it? Your wife is dying. Who would object to that? Where it gets really dicey is when you think about your children and say, well, gee, I really would like to give my kid a leg up. I'd like them to be, maybe their IQ, I could increase by 20%. I could make them 7 feet tall. And that's where it really gets to be confusing. And in the book, there were a number of specific things where the Chinese created CRISPR edited babies. There was twin girls, and their intention was really good in that there's a real problem of HIV in China. And what they did is they modified genes so that these two little girls would not be likely to get HIV, regardless of the behavior. The problem came up where there were other impacts. You change this gene and you don't realize you're also impacting something else. And so there's a lot of evidence that the lifespan of these two girls have been negatively affected. And who the hell had the right to do that? And there's always a gray area of what is the motivation of the scientists in developing the technology. It's often well, monetary. They want to develop the technology and sell it, or in the academic world, it can be their motivation is they want to be the chair of the department or the big wheel in their university or their research institution. So if this has stimulated some of your own thinking and has raised some opinion or thought about, please raise your hand. I'll keep talking until I get some questions. One area, tremendous potential. Oh, Al, we have Al. Let's get him on here.
Well, Brian's talk reminded me of this, and yours question reminds me of, we're trying to design utopias. And over the years, a number of authors have written books on what a utopia might look like.
Yeah.
And the question I'd like to ask of this discussion on CRISPR is, in this world of the future, what would we want the ideal human being to look like? And do we really, are we smart enough to even think about this? Because all the books that I know about utopias, there are some significant flaws with the utopias that the authors have conceived. So is natural evolution a much better way of designing the human being of the future than having imperfect human beings trying to meddle in the process?
Yeah, yeah.
Let me answer your question, Al, real simply. I want the future human beings to look like me. Okay, well, yeah, that self-centered, goes to a huge amount of human history, and we have a long history of deciding that we know better than Mother Nature. Oh, I don't know, say straightening out rivers, damming up the Missouri River, on and on and on and on. And Mother Nature tends to push back on us at some point or another. So I'm a little concerned that we have the human hubris at this point jumping in there. And this is maybe a little off of the ethics, but it's just, human hubris, I think, is a problem we've always dealt with. And if we start designing babies that will win Olympic medals, I think we're going to get bit in the ass somehow or another. In my 2 cents, anyway. So the answer, Al, is me. I want it to look like me.
Okay.
Well, sort of reinforcing your question, Al, was in the Code Breakers, and this goes back to the 70s, there was a Princeton theologian that wrote a book on, according to Isaacson, the book was rather dense, but he did have this great quote that before you try to design gods in humans, we better figure out how to be good humans just as we are.
Bill, are you calling on people?
No, I'd rather have you. I don't know the.
Oh, okay. I'll do it. I didn't know I was doing it. So I raised my hand a little while ago. So one quick comment: you don't actually need CRISPR to do a certain amount of genetic engineering, because we are able to clone individuals. And has that been done with humans? Well, it hasn't been in the news, but I suspect it probably has been, and probably could be without too much effort. So some of these issues have been around for a while and been discussed, especially if you wanted to make everybody look just like me. Cloning is the obvious way to go. You don't use CRISPR for that. But anyway, the next person who has a real point to make is Jim Blinn, and I have to send you an unmute request. There you go, Jim.
Yeah, my question is sort of related, which is, who decides what kind of gene editing should be allowed? I know that is it each country gets to make their own decision? Is there an international organization? And who are the people on it? Are they politicians? Are they scientists? Can you give me a summary of what's going on now and what they're thinking of?
Well, I'll respond by it. In Isaacson's book, there are a number of chapters which tracked the efforts to come up with, and it was very much ad hoc. You know, mostly it was the scientists developing the technologies, because they were the only ones who really understood what was real, a possibility. So that I think is what's going on. And then there's international aspects. Some of these organizations are international in trying to set protocols for what would be appropriate and what would be avoided.
Let me make another point. Actually, it's a question, because I haven't read the book and everything, but it's pretty clear that you, through a certain amount of gene editing, you might be able to reprogram somebody's bone marrow genes and cure lymphoma or something for that individual. But that's not going to carry through to the next generation. If we're really talking about engineering new kinds of human beings, we're going to have to do it in a way that affects people before they're born. In other words, you'd have to be doing the gene editing on the sperm genes and the ovum genes so that they'd show up in the next generation. Is that what we're talking about now?
Well, but they're two different classes. That's what I tried to set the scene in the beginning.
Oh, I missed the very beginning. Sorry, I missed the very beginning. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The so-called somatic gene editing is where you take an individual and he's got a defective gene, and you solve his gene, and there's no passing on. As you point out, if you want to design your kids, you've got to go after the reproductive cells in your body, and that affects your kids. One real issue that you're raising, Paul, is that just doing the simple thing, the first step, the treatment of one person for a defective gene, the affordability, this can be like $1 million a person. So there is a lot of work on finding other ways to edit genes without the need of extracting a bone marrow or something like that. You need a delivery method. So there's a lot of work on to bring that cost down. But at the present time, the cost is just prohibitive for most people.
Yeah, well, it will come down. This is still research.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think the area of cancer is quite interesting. And I think, Mike, you have something to bring to this table. That there's been a work on using CRISPR-Cas9 to disable a gene that produces a protein called PD-1, and that stops the cell's immune response. So cancer cells sometimes trigger the PD-1 response themselves so that they protect themselves against immune system response to the cancer.
Yeah, let me just talk on this, Bill, and just the PD-1 receptor on a cell is blocked by the tumor, which means the cells itself cannot launch an immune response. That's essentially what's going on here. Keytruda, which is the Merck compound, blocks the PD-1 receptor. As a result, the body can launch an immune response against certain cancers. Not all cancers, but that's essentially what's going on. So therapy exists that achieves this objective now. Okay, I want to make that point now.
Okay.
The second point I want to make, which is regarding cancer therapy. Cancer gene mutations are incredibly complex. So I know this is a little off center from your designer children approach, which I think is the thrust of this conversation, but just to give the audience some idea of the complexity here. In certain cancers, there are over 120 gene mutations, 120. The question you have is, which do I target to alter? I mean, that's a big question. There are certain receptors and genes that basically have a bigger impact than others. So that I don't know about. But let's say something that I do know something about, and this audience should know something about. The BRCA9 gene has been heralded in breast cancer as a precursor for predicting breast cancer in your family. Okay, it's long established. BRCA9 gene is a genetic diagnostic test that women should go as a predictor of whether they will get breast cancer. That predictability is only 20% effective. In other words, 80% of the people who do not have that defective wind up with breast cancer. So I think, you know, quite frankly, this topic is extremely complex, beyond just push a button, this gene works, bingo, I'm cured for life and all this other nonsense. It is a long road to hoe. Now, if I can just diverse and get to the topic which you're addressing. There is a growth hormone on the market known as somatotropin. Somatotropin effectively is the protein that allows your children to grow. That is available today. Genentech has produced this for 20 years, so hence it is somewhat parallel thinking to what essentially your issue is. Can I design my child? Now, realistically, what happens is that there are restrictions on the use of somatotropin in children. And what's happened is there's been backdoor, if you will, mission creep associated with the use of somatotropin. For example, a physician can argue that my child's or the patient's child's bone structure is essentially impaired, which could lead to disease. So you see this kind of backdoor type of therapeutic mission creep that allows this drug to be currently sold in the United States. There is no hierarchy body which is ruling on the proprietary of using somatotropin if you want your child to be 6 feet tall. So this is what I think is going to happen with gene therapy, that there's going to be this idea that somehow a disease will emanate from altering, you know, essentially a gene which affects somebody's physical attributes that will be essentially passed down to future generations under some type of artificial need, disease preventative, that type of thing. So that's where I think at least history has taken us, and I've said enough.
Thanks, Mike. That's very helpful. Paul, who's next?
You're muted, Paul.
Sorry, I'm muted. Mitch. Mitch, you have to unmute.
I'm sorry, that was me talking earlier. I didn't lower my hand. Anyway, go ahead, everybody.
Okay, next is Steve Barley.
I think the distinction that Bill drew at the beginning is critical. That is the distinction between curing disease and designer babies. And I recognize from what Mike just said that sometimes that line isn't as clear as we'd like it to be. But it seems to me that we really have to draw the line at curing babies. And my reason for thinking that is that one of the greatest problems we face as a nation right now is income and wealth inequality. And I am truly concerned, particularly given the cost of some of this gene editing, that this will just be another way that those who are at the top of the economic pyramid will be able to sustain that for their progeny. And if you don't think they're going to do that, I just asked you to think back to a year ago when we learned about a college admissions scandal. And we learned about people like Lori Loughlin and others who were willing to spend vast sums in order to get their youngsters, undeservedly, into the best schools. So that's my concern. I think we need a bright line that is set here in terms of designer babies.
Okay, so next, Mike Martin again, or is this from
No,
your hand? Hand
it's
was
fine.
raised. Yeah, we didn't lower your hand. Okay. Herb Waddell, you're up next.
Well, I think my questions kind of faded away with time, but the only way you will control anything, like we heard about at the meeting, or this topic we're discussing now, is for us to produce a benign dictator with unlimited power to impose his or her will on everybody, because we diverge. We all, if, for instance, a religious message, hey, that should be compelling, but it's not, the one message is not compelling to everyone. Everyone has different ideas of what the ultimate will be. So these are all pipe dreams when it comes to worldwide control of our sustainability, our growth, economic growth, which didn't even take into account government printing of money. So I just say this is all a utopian dream, and it's good mental exercise, but mankind will not adopt on a grand scale genetic engineering of the human race because of these pitfalls that Mike has pointed out on numerous occasions. We're just too complicated.
Well, Herb, I'd like to respectfully disagree in the sense that if you read the Isaacson book, there are individuals. There's this guy, Josiah Zahner. He's a PhD, a biophysicist. I mean, bright guy, but he's also a way out there person.
That's
And
the point exactly, way out.
yeah, but let me make the point. He was at a conference and he injected himself during the conference and edited his genes. There's such a thing as a technology that can be self-destructive unless we as a society.
Well, editing his genes sounds like he knows exactly what's going to happen.
No,
That's a godlike.
No, he didn't know what was going to happen. But he was. It's kind of like Steve Jobs, I mean, a change comes by those people that are just aggressive enough to put themselves out there and do something and see what happens. So the technology is coming. It's here already in some regards, and it's going to continue to be an issue. So we're going to have
with a vaccine. We're being urged to take a vaccine which has effects on us that are unpredicted. And of course, in a year or two, we'll know a lot more about it. But that has an issue of urgency. You got to do something. But gene editing is a little less urgent. And as Mike continually points out, don't know what's going to happen when you mess around with the body. With one gene, he said, had hundreds of mutations. And we have what, 10,000 genes? And
Well, let me pose a question, if I may. Although there are other people have their hand up. I don't want to dominate this. Paul, who's next? Oh, he's on the phone. All right, I'll make my point. Let's say.
John Tomaszewski.
Oh, good. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to lighten it up a little bit for,
Good.
I'm a science fiction guy, and I've seen probably every movie there is about engineering the genes. But I put in the link, probably one of the best ones for those of you who haven't seen it, Gattaca, which really expresses kind of what would happen if society went this route. And you're having a baby and you go down to the your doctor, and it's basically designed, and it shows some of the pitfalls of it. So for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a great movie, Gattaca.
Great. Thanks.
Okay,
Well,
I guess Mitch has his hand up next, unless it's left up from before. Mitch? Guess not. So Brian check. Yeah. Brian?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for letting me join this session too. It's fascinating stuff. The only thing I wanted to throw in there was a little bit from the limits to growth literature, which the point that as limits to growth hit us, a great deal of the complexity that we have adopted is going to crumble. And so, some of the new technologies may be a part of that. And I was thinking that, like, when some of these two recent rocket launches, right? Bezos and the other fella, that's the kind of thing that, while folks that haven't thought about limits to growth, or that aren't in that discussion, they think that's the wave of the future and so on. Whereas a lot of us who are in the ecological macroeconomics see that as, just a blip in the history of humans. It was brought up before about the rich people being able to afford some of this stuff, well, while nobody else could. Yeah, there's that, and that's part of our efforts towards steady statesmanship. Also, since Herb had his comments, then I added on something that I wanted to mention, because I think Herb was addressing both CRISPR and the steady state economy. And I agree. It often would seem sort of pie in the sky, like, okay, what are we going to do? Have a benign dictator that establishes a steady state economy. Yet on the other hand, there's also philosophically, there's the deal about, well, what's the use of not trying, and it's not rocket science. It's not like a bunch of Bezos is flying into outer space. It's very controllable to everyone out there, the level of consumption, who you vote for, what kind of policies they're going to adopt in terms of the macroeconomy. So we feel that steady statesmanship is very doable, although obviously really ambitious and far from the status quo at this point in history.
well, it has unexpected fallout too. Look at China had their one-child policy. Now they regret it because they don't have workers. It's various aspects of it have been tried, and it depends on everyone complying with someone with the ultimate intelligence directing it. And these are just not things that happen. We don't have the ultimate genius with unlimited power to impose his will.
I'd like to make a comment here. I think that in a certain sense, we do. The ultimate benevolent dictator that will handle all of these problems is Mother Nature. You know, a demographer will observe that when there's an excessive growth of some population and resources run out, then there are die-offs, and either the population collapses either from starvation or from fighting each other and killing each other, and then that population declines. You know, I mean, the same thing is bound to happen with humans, even in terms of the economy and so on. In the long term, the resources are finite. You can't grow infinitely if you have finite resources. So one way or another, nature will handle it. You know, and the human race is kind of an experiment by nature, because it's the first time nature has produced highly intelligent beings that can understand things like the stars and so on and so forth. But in another sense, we're like everybody else. You know, maybe we're too smart for ourselves. We came close to nuclear annihilation a few years ago. It wasn't that long ago. And, you know, we try to invent better human beings by CRISPR or something, and there will be bad consequences to that. And, you know, maybe those individuals will die. So in the grand long-term scheme of things, it is actually a self-correcting situation. Now, people like Brian are really trying to say, well, we don't have to let it go to the point of catastrophic solutions like die-outs of whole populations. You know, maybe if we're smart enough, we can guide it onto a sustainable path without letting Mother Nature do its thing to us. What do you say about that?
Oh, me? I say that's very perceptive. And that will ultimately be what happens. Because you cannot control the billions of people in the world and impose one rule on all of them, even if the rule was somehow the best. You'll always have people cheating on the system. You'll always have people taking power and doing what they want. So you've just described what will actually happen. One way or another, the balance will shift and restore itself.
Yeah. I'd like to pose a specific development. Let's say somebody comes up with gene editing technology that can reverse dementia. And, you know, this is a very relevant issue for this group. Or let's say your wife, you know, got dementia, and then technology came out. Well, of course, you would want to use that technology to bring back your loved one. But that same technology would be able to be used to enhance memory in younger kids and create super geniuses in kids. So I'm very sympathetic to the first use, but very opposed to the second use. What do other people feel about that?
Well, I agree, but I'd like to ask, you know, we talked about this session as being about the ethics of gene editing. And is the driving notion that when you talk about ethics, are we talking about a fairness concept that that if advances are to be made, they should apply to everybody? They should not be used for one group to get advantage over somebody else, which would be unfair? Or are we talking about something deeper and the ethics of possibly doing great damage to the whole human species by trying to edit genes too much, and therefore you know, sort of polluting the gene pool somehow, and causing damage at a much more widespread scale?
I think both of those are dimensions of the moral aspect of this. Isaacson in the book was talking about the argument that some of the great geniuses of history have been schizophrenic, or and half of the most famous authors had mental deficiencies. So that argues against trying to Al's utopia planning kind of thing, that it's, and people dealing with autism, or overcoming mental problems that they have by their own will, and learning how to cope with stuff like that.
Yeah. So Al Aho, you've got your hand up again. You're next.
I just wanted to support Herb's comment that the human body is very complicated. And just as an illustration, we can't get software right. So, and if you look at the debate in artificial intelligence and machine learning and trying to make it bias-free, we haven't solved that problem yet. So,
I have to interject.
I agree with Herb.
I have to interject for Brian's sake. Al just won the most major prize in software development. It is sort of sometimes referred to as the Nobel Prize of computer science. So Al knows what he's talking about. Okay, sorry for that interjection, guys. So George Cole, you have your hand up.
Yeah, actually, we're already doing a very gross type of genetic engineering, in that with the artificial insemination, they can take the fetus and do an analysis on the genes and selectively decide which ones they're going to implant.
Yeah.
But again, because of the way it works, they have to insert multiple fetuses or zygotes into the carrier, into the womb, to be able to do that. So there's still some chance of probability of randomness involved. The other thing is, we know so little about how the genes really react and work. And one example is the sickle cell anemia, which they've decided is just one gene. And when they try to cure it with CRISPR, they just have all unintended consequences, let's put it that way, where the body just seems to know that it's not doing what it was supposed to do.
Yeah.
So Mike Martin, you're up again.
I think Bill raised a rather intriguing question about this duality of, there's an immediate good and a long-term uncharted consequence, i.e., seeking a cure short-term, and then the unknown consequences of affecting offspring with certain mental disabilities or expected. I guess to answer this question, we're looking for some committee to render an opinion in these areas, and that already exists. The FDA makes these decisions. Essentially, they've made all the decisions on essentially gene editing and experimentation up to this point. They had temporarily halted gene editing therapy because of unwanted side effects. which were essentially unforeseeable. But I guess let me get to a recent example, which is germane to what Bill is talking about. The FDA recently approved a drug for Alzheimer's disease by Biogen. By any measure, there was really no empirical proof that this had any real discernible effect, at least statistically. Okay, and that's the gold standard which the FDA does. But nevertheless, they approved it. So getting back to Bill's assertion about whether a drug that would improve your chances of curing Alzheimer's disease and with some unknown consequence, I think it would be highly likely that that would be approved by the FDA and probably subsequently abused by, for a variety of reasons, by physicians who might prescribe it for off-label use. So I see a clear precedent that whereas this, as I referred to before, as mission creep, would essentially exist, and there's probably very little what we could do to stop it, given the examples at least I've cited. So that would be my a comment on Bill's question.
Rich Jager.
Yeah, Bill raised the question just a little bit ago, contrasting the case where you use this technology to try to cure a disease in a person versus the ethics of somebody, presumably people with more means, using it to do a little bit of designing a baby who might be smarter, for example. I guess I don't see a real ethical problem in that second case, and maybe I'm taking the other side from the thought that Bill expressed. I think part of the reason for being against any sort of designer baby is the idea that we're going to do Brave New World, which is certainly a dystopian view of a future, but we get from natural consequences, natural selection. We get Einsteins, we get Joseph Stalins, and it's some of the things that I've read and thought about indicate that a certain diversity in the gene pool is a good thing. And so if somebody introduces something which might actually wind up being in the gene pool through a designer baby, that strikes me as not necessarily bad. And if there are unintended consequences and that does not work out well, that Mother Nature will take care of that. If it winds up being something, a good addition to the gene pool, well, Mother Nature will also take care of that. The question, I think, sometimes comes down to whether it's the people of means who can do that, and then that gets into the whole question of wealth equality, income equality. But in terms of the ethics of a designer baby itself, that might be a good thing. I'll leave it at that.
Mitch Erickson, you're up again.
Yeah, I'm actually keying right off of what Rich just said, and that is that if you go back about right around the turn of the century, we were engaged in the Human Genome Project that had all sorts of side melodramas and stuff. But at the end of the day, if I remember correctly, it was about a $3 billion cost to do the first human genome. And now we can get it done for about 20 bucks, $200. Now, that's 200 bucks is eminently affordable for those of us on this call, not so much for substantial portions of humanity, but still, as we talk about the equity issues of CRISPR, one can expect that the cost will go down, as it gets automated, et cetera. And so we may very well be able to do CRISPR for a couple of $100. And so I'm not overly worried about that particular aspect of the equity. I am overly worried about the various international issues, because if there's something truly advantageous to anything that we can do with CRISPR to humans or agriculture or whatever, I can see it being weaponized in the international arena. So there's another little angle, but I'm not overly worried about the excess cost in a couple of decades. It'll be virtually free, my opinion.
Griff Smith. Griff, you.
Yes, I did. Given that CRISPR has demonstrated that it's very difficult to make it precisely specific to an intended genome, and it almost always affects other parts of your genome because they match the sequence that you were trying to modify, I would be very nervous to blow my very limited contribution to the genome, hoping that I would create a super person when actually I would blow my last chance to get into the genome at all.
Good point. Steve Barley. Steve, yes.
Thank you, Paul. I'm not as optimistic as Mitch is in terms of the cost of gene editing dropping. And I think the relevant metaphor that we might use is IV fertilization. If a family member of yours has ever gone through this, or if you're aware of friends who have gone through this, these techniques have been around for decades. And yet, if you go to a fertility clinic, you will find that you are spending tens and tens of thousands of dollars to make this happen. It's the counseling, it's the testing, it's the drugs. This stuff is not cheap. And I'm willing to bet that gene editing would remain beyond the means of almost everyone for a very long time.
George Cull.
Yeah, I'd like to bring up the point that we haven't discussed here, and that's the old debate versus nature versus nurture. In other words, if we cloned Einstein's genome, would we get another Einstein?
Well, you don't have to actually use CRISPR to do that. You have to use these cloning techniques that have been around longer.
No, but what I'm saying
No,
is,
it's a good point. I know.
a lot of it, even if you modify some genes, will it enhance or detract due to the environment? For example, cancer. They still don't know whether certain cancers are genetic in origin or
Right. Or the best laboratory that we've had for that, of course, is identical twins, and especially ones that were separated at birth, and see how similar their lives have been since then. I mean, there are cases like that, and they're very, very valuable for this kind of research. But I can't give you any answers.
Yeah, what I wanted to throw out was, and this is unscientific, but a lot of very bright people are very unstable. I mean, behaviorally unstable. So I don't know what that means. It's like the very creative people, the hypersensitive people. Often real life is just too toxic for these people. And so maybe that's a risk of genetically improving the intelligence of people.
Yeah. Papi Sen, you have raised your hand. You have to unmute. Papi, you have to unmute.
Yeah,
There you go.
I think all this discussion that we are having of choosing our own destiny seems to be far-fetched in some ways, but may not be far-fetched. Now, to a person, especially in a code breaker discussion, we seem to think that we have more control than we do. I mean, it's like presenting, it's like knowing that stochastic process does not exist. I mean, everything is deterministic. And that's the problem. I don't know how people could say that. I mean, even if you know everything, there is something random about it that will completely foil that out. So the stochastic, to understand stochastic process or random number is not easy. There's always a randomness that will exist. And so the CRISPR discussion says that you have solved that problem. And that's what my point I want to make.
So Papi and I both have advanced degrees in statistics, so we actually know what a stochastic process is. But let it be said, that simply means that there is always randomness, which you cannot control. Bill, your mouth is moving, but you're muted.
There's also expected values. And if you
Yes.
do stuff, you increase the expected
Yes.
value.
Yes, yes, there is.
There's a control aspect.
Yeah.
That's true.
Mitch Erickson.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on something Bill said towards the top of this conversation. He was quoting a guy named Josiah Zahner from the Isaacson book, who's the biohacker. And he raises some interesting issues beyond just simply injecting himself in a conference in front of everybody. One of the things that he is proposing and concerned with is the biohacking on a military level. And, you know, he's been arguing that the military should be much more involved in terms of doing some research on what we can do, for instance, to use CRISPR to control against, you know, a designer virus, for instance. And one of the things that also got mentioned right in that same general area by Isaacson is DARPA, the inventor of the internet and all that other kind of good stuff. DARPA actually has funded George Church, who's one of the luminaries in this CRISPR business, to do some research on if we could figure out a way to protect against radiation damage in cells. So the military angle of this thing brings up another whole ethical issue, both in the terms of, you know, us being the white hat guys that would you know, protect against stuff, but also the rogue nation or the rogue sect that would somehow biohack in and get us some outcomes we really don't want to have happen. So the ethics goes in a lot of different directions.
Good point. George Cole.
Yeah, just to add to Mitch's comment, can anybody say SARS-CoV-2? Again, probably a bioengineering mistake that got out. But in that case, you know, a very good example of problems.
Mitch, you still have a hand up. It's probably because you didn't lower it. Do you want to speak
I'm
again?
sorry. Yeah, I didn't lower it. I'm sorry. Anyway.
Okay, anybody else? maybe our discussion has run its course. Bill? Unmute.
One thing that Isaacson threw out in his chapter, "Who should decide about the use of this technology?" There was the principle that individuals should be at liberty to do what they want as long as they do no harm to others. Now, that's fine to have as a line item, but I don't know if it guides approvals. I mean, how do you know until you've done it?
It's great as a principle, but you know, it sort of
Is it-
goes against human nature, you know, like it's like in the case of wearing masks during COVID
Yeah,
or getting vaccinated.
yeah. Well, we've been at this for about an hour. And I don't see any more questions coming up. So I'd like to propose that we bring close to this discussion. Yeah, so we had a very good response to it. A good group of people have shown up, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.
So,
Mike
Yeah.
Martin finally raised his hand one
oh,
more
Mike,
time.
yeah, go for it.
That's just a thank you, Bill. Thank you for doing this.
Okay,
Okay, guys, have a good day.
thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Here.
So long, everybody.
I know.